Welcome to Coworking Insights Podcast.
Coworking Insights. We're going to give you data in its lives.
Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Sam Marks and I'm joined here with Alex Nicoriș from Bucharest, our favorite Romanian, and a wonderful, wonderful colleague. And today we're going to be speaking about co-working capacity stats. I'm super excited about this, Alex.
Hi, Sam. I'm super excited to be today on the podcast to talk about this amazing data. We've been looking at it recently, and I'm super excited to share some information with our listeners on this podcast episode.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe we start with just kind of thinking about capacity data. So we're talking about what is the average amount of people that a co-working space can hold or can fit. Why do you think that this might be important, Alex, to a co-working space manager or maybe even a real estate developer out there?
Well, I think it's important to have this data in mind because, you know, there are a lot of freelancers and entrepreneurs popping everywhere around the world and digital nomads and people moving here and there. And people have to know how many people can accommodate in their co-working space. So basically, this is why this data is important to know.
I also think it's interesting, and those great points, that we're seeing a move and trend into larger spaces. So I think it's very useful to know how your space might rank or compare next to a global average or a country average or even a city average of capacity to know if you can fit more or less people than average in your local market. So we're going to review a couple of stats here. First, maybe the most interesting one and the one for everyone to get their head around first is the global average of capacity of 11,000 co-working spaces. Alex, you want to clue us in to what that number is?
Yes, the global average co-working capacity is 83.5. So basically, a space on a global average can hold up to 83 people or 83.5 people.
Now, Alex, in your experience visiting co-working spaces around the world, would you say that that number came in higher or lower than your expectations?
I think an average co-working space that's based on the size of the spaces and the way they organize and they design the space. I think it's a pretty good number to hold.
I think because I spent so much time the last 2 or 3 years in Asia and some markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, even down in Sydney, up in Shanghai, I feel like that number was a little bit lower than my expectations. I thought it would be somewhere up over 100. But then when you think about it, and we'll go into some of the continental averages now, there are a lot of smaller spaces out there. And we'll find out pretty soon that Asia is actually the largest on average capacity. But there is a lot of markets, especially in Europe, that are much smaller. So let's go into some of that data right now. I'm going to review real quick the continental averages for capacity. So keep in mind, as Alex said, the global average is currently 83.5 people per space. So Asia leading the pack with the largest capacity on an average of 113.5, followed by North America at 100 and even 100. Africa in third place with an average capacity per space of 86 people, followed by Oceania. And Oceania we categorize as Australia, New Zealand, and some of the surrounding island nations. That comes in at 83, followed by Europe at 61 as an average capacity per space, then down to Central America at 59, and South America at the lowest per space average capacity of 53. Alex, any takeaways or insights from that data we just reviewed?
I was about to ask, did you expect Europe to be on the 5th spot?
Well, it makes sense when you think about it and compare it to all the other nations, because in our time, and of course you're in Bucharest, Alex, but we spent a lot of time in Spain. In fact, we're opening an office in Barcelona coming up. You know, a lot of the construction there, a lot of the buildings, they can be 200, 300, 400 years old. Whereas in Asia and North America, it's a lot of new construction. And as a whole, and this is a general statement, a lot of the construction is becoming much bigger. So Europe, you can get a lot of these old buildings that are much smaller, and they're retrofitting these to be co-working spaces, where in Asia, North America, it's a lot of brand new construction, and you see these mega complexes. So it does make sense when you think about it. I would say when we were pulling this data, I didn't come up with that calculation in my head, but looking at it in hindsight, yeah, I think it makes sense.
I think it does. There might be some other factors that would influence this number, but I think overall this would be maybe the most important to look at.
I think what would be fun is if we review 4 big name cities and review a little bit of data from there. We'll try to get a couple of cities in different continents so that people that are listening in might be able to have a little bit more of a comparable. Alex, why don't you pick a couple cities that ring a bell and might be interesting to some of the listeners?
As I live in Europe, I'm going to choose 2 European cities. So I'm going to start with Amsterdam, which has an average of 78, and Bucharest 72. Not a big difference, right? Even if they're very different cities on very different parts of the continent. Do you want to continue with some cities that you've been traveling to recently?
I'm just looking at those. So Amsterdam at 78, Bucharest 72. So both below the global average capacity of 83.5. Yeah, so I'll jump into a couple more. Mentioned Hong Kong earlier. And Hong Kong's an interesting market in Asia because there's just so limited real estate. So they're building higher and higher and higher and trying to squeeze more and more, make spaces more dense. And the average capacity there is 85. So almost on the global average of 83.5, but much smaller or much less capacity on a whole than Asia, which is 113. And anyone that goes to Hong Kong, I'm sure can draw conclusions to that. They're really, really packing stuff in there. And then you have Miami, which is where I'm heading next week, actually, in my home state of Florida, with a whopping 154 average capacity. So much larger than all the other cities that we've just taken a look at. And also much, much larger than the highest average capacity of a continent of Asia at 113. So Miami, they're making some big places and some big spaces there. We've covered some really interesting data. I think that capacity data is super, if nothing else, it's very interesting, but I think it's also very practical for space owners to think about how many people they can fit in their space and how that compares to local markets, whether it's city, country, or even continental averages.
Yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I think this data is very important. Space owners, they always think on how they can make greater impact. They can bring community together. They can have all types of people coming into their co-working space, how they can help their members do business with other future members or people that just like to hang out in the co-working space. And I think this number can have an impact on how these people think of all the environment they're creating around their co-working space.
Well, guys, if you like this episode, please take a look and download our size and capacity report. We've just started putting it together. So if you liked this information, it's also going to include the average square feet, which we're calling size, in the report. And it's also going to take a look at density. So how many people can you fit in your space per square size? We're going to look at that on country, continental, and city averages. I think that data is super interesting. How dense is it in a co-working space, and how are different countries and continents configuring their space to maximize efficiency and occupancy? So take a look at that. You can go to coworkinginsights.com, click on reports, and you'll see that report, brand new, fresh in there. And also, this episode is brought to you by Coworker's premium plans. If you're a space manager looking to attract new members, check out coworker.com's pro and featured plan. Up to 8 times as many reviews and profile impressions with those 2 plans. Just log in and click upgrade to see your different options there. And that's it for this week, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Nice and short at 10 minutes on the button. And stay tuned next week for some great new episodes and content from Coworking Insights.
Thank you for listening to the Coworking Insights podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode and more.
Coworking Insights. We're going to get là-bas.